An elderly father arrives at his son's wedding, only to discover his assigned seat bears a cruel nameplate reading Burden instead of his name. Humiliated and heartbroken, he's ready to leave when the priest begins the ceremony with an unexpected reading that stops everyone cold, revealing a deeper truth about family, sacrifice, and the true meaning of love that will transform not just the wedding, but the fractured relationship between father and son forever. I stood at the entrance of St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Chicago, adjusting my tie for the third time. The September air carried that crisp hint of autumn, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows. My hands trembled slightly, not from nerves about the wedding, but from the medication I'd been taking since my last hospital stay. At 74, my body wasn't what it used to be, but I wasn't about to miss my son Michael's wedding day. The cathedral was magnificent, exactly the kind of place Michael and Sarah had dreamed of. Gothic arches stretched toward heaven, and white roses adorned every pew. I'd helped pay for some of this, not that anyone would acknowledge it. The money I'd saved from 40 years of working double shifts at the steel mill, the same money that had put Michael through law school, was now helping create his perfect day. I walked slowly down the side aisle, my cane clicking softly against the marble floor. The guests were already seated, Sarah's family on the right, filling nearly 3/4 of the church with their extended relatives, colleagues from the law firm, and friends from their country club. Our side looked sparse in comparison. Just a few of my old co-workers, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, and some distant cousins. I approached the front rows where immediate family was supposed to sit. This was the moment I'd been looking forward to, taking my rightful place as the father of the groom. I'd imagined sitting in the front row, maybe having Michael catch my eye and smile, remembering all we'd been through together after his mother died when he was just 16. But as I reached the second pew on the left side, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, placed precisely where I was supposed to sit, was a small white card with elegant script, but instead of reading Mr. Robert Sullivan, father of the groom, it said something that made my heart skip a beat. Burden. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd been having trouble with my vision lately, another side effect of getting older. But no, the word was clear as day. Burden. My legs felt weak, and I gripped my cane tighter. I looked around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the guests were chatting amongst themselves, admiring the flowers, taking photos. I stood there frozen, staring at that card, feeling like someone had just punched me in the stomach. "Excuse me, sir?" A young usher approached me. He couldn't have been more than 20, probably one of Sarah's cousins. "Are you looking for your seat?" I pointed at the card with a shaking finger. This is where I'm supposed to sit?" The usher glanced down, and his face flushed red. "Oh, let me check the seating chart." He fumbled with a clipboard, clearly flustered. "You're Mr. Sullivan, right? The father of the groom?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "There must be some mistake," he said, but his tone suggested he knew exactly what was happening. Let me go find someone." He hurried away, leaving me standing there with that awful word staring up at me. Burden. Is that really what I'd become to my son? After everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd given up to raise him alone after Maria died. I thought about all those nights I'd worked overtime to pay for his college applications, his law school tuition, his bar exam fees. I thought about the times I'd driven him to debate tournaments, waited in hospital lobbies when he had his appendix out, celebrated every achievement as if it were my own. But maybe he was right. Maybe I had become a burden. The past 2 years had been rough, I'll admit that. My health had declined after the heart attack, and I'd had to move out of the old house into a smaller apartment. I'd needed help with some things, rides to doctor's appointments when my license got suspended after that minor fender bender, someone to help me sort through insurance paperwork that seemed to get more complicated every year. Michael had been patient at first, but I could see the frustration building. The way he'd sigh when I called, the way Sarah would look at her phone and whisper, "It's your father again," when I tried to reach them, the way family dinners became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I'd tried not to be a burden, God knows I'd tried. I'd learned to use grocery delivery services, figured out how to pay bills online, even started taking the bus to most of my appointments. But there were some things an old man just couldn't manage alone, and every time I had to ask for help, I could see that look in Michael's eyes, the same look he used to give his homework when it was particularly difficult. The usher returned with an older woman I recognized as Sarah's mother, Mrs. Hendricks. She was impeccably dressed in a navy blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her gray hair styled in perfect waves. "Mr. Sullivan," she said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm so sorry about this confusion. It seems there was a mix-up with the place cards." But I could see the truth in her eyes. This wasn't a mix-up, this was intentional. "Where exactly am I supposed to sit?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She gestured vaguely toward the back of the church. "We've prepared a lovely spot for you in the 4th row. You'll have a wonderful view of the ceremony." The 4th row. Behind Sarah's extended family, behind her work colleagues, behind people who barely knew Michael existed until last year, I was being relegated to the back like some distant acquaintance who'd crashed the wedding. I looked toward the front of the church where Michael stood waiting with his groomsmen. He was adjusting his boutonniere, laughing at something his best man had whispered in his ear. He looked so handsome in his tuxedo, so confident and successful. Everything I'd hoped he would become, but he hadn't looked in my direction once. As I made my way toward the back of the church, I passed whispered conversations and sideways glances. Some of Sarah's relatives were already seated, and I caught fragments of their discussions. Heard he's been having health problems. Sarah says he calls constantly. Such a shame when they become so dependent. Each word felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. I found my assigned seat in the 4th row and lowered myself carefully onto the pew. From here, Michael looked small and distant. I might as well have been watching the wedding on television. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor, was seated a few rows ahead. She turned around and gave me a sympathetic smile, but I could see the confusion in her eyes too. She knew I should be sitting up front. Everyone who really knew our family knew that. The organist began playing, signaling that the ceremony was about to start. I watched as Michael took his place at the altar, still not looking back toward the congregation. The groomsmen lined up beside him, all young, successful lawyers like himself, all wearing matching smiles and expensive watches. Then the music changed, and Sarah appeared at the back of the church with her father. She was breathtaking in her white gown, radiant with happiness. Her father beamed with pride as he prepared to walk her down the aisle. I remembered when Maria and I had gotten married 46 years ago in a little church outside of Pittsburgh. We couldn't afford anything this elaborate, but we'd been just as happy. I watched Sarah's father escort her with such dignity, such obvious joy at giving away his daughter. That should have been me with Michael someday, if he ever decided to have children. That should have been my moment to feel that paternal pride, but instead I was sitting in the back row, labeled as a burden. As Sarah and her father passed my row, I caught a glimpse of her face. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something flicker there. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But then she looked away and continued toward the altar where my son waited. The priest stepped forward as Sarah reached the altar. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle voice that carried clearly through the cathedral. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Michael and Sarah in holy matrimony." I tried to focus on his words, but my mind kept drifting to that place card. Burden. How long had Michael felt this way? When exactly had I stopped being his father and become his obligation? The priest continued with the traditional opening, talking about love and commitment, about the bonds that tie families together. But then he paused, looking out over the congregation with those wise, weathered eyes. "Before we continue," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I'd like to read something that Michael asked me to include in today's ceremony. He said it was very important to him." Michael looked surprised, glancing at Sarah with confusion. She shrugged slightly, clearly not knowing what the priest was referring to. The priest reached into his robe and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The entire church fell silent, every guest leaning forward slightly to hear what he was about to say. "This is a letter," the priest announced, "written by Michael's father." My heart stopped. I hadn't written any letter. What was happening? The priest unfolded the paper and began to read in his clear, resonant voice. "My dear son, if you are hearing this, it means you've decided to include this reading in your wedding ceremony, and for that, I am grateful. There are things I need you to know, things I've never been able to say properly." I felt the blood drain from my face. Those weren't my words, but somehow they felt familiar. The priest continued, "I know I've become difficult lately. I know my health problems and my needs have put a strain on our relationship. I see how tired you get when I call, how frustrated you become when I need help with things that used to be so simple for me." My hands were shaking now. I gripped the pew in front of me, my knuckles white. The priest's voice echoed through the cathedral as he continued reading what he claimed was my letter. But these weren't words I'd ever written. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. "I want you to know that I never intended to become a burden to you," the priest read, and the word hit me like a physical blow. There it was again. Burden. When your mother died, I made a promise to her that I would do everything in my power to give you the life she wanted for you. I worked those double shifts not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Every overtime hour, every missed weekend, every sacrifice, it was all worth it to see you succeed. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes. These words, wherever they came from, were speaking truths I'd carried in my heart for decades, but had never been able to express properly. Michael stood frozen at the altar, his face pale, his eyes searching the crowd until they finally found mine in that back row. The recognition in his eyes was immediate and devastating. I see now that my pride may have cost us our relationship, the priest continued. I was so determined to never ask for your help, to never admit that I was struggling, that I pushed you away when I should have been honest about what I needed. Mrs. Patterson turned around again, and I could see tears in her eyes too. She knew. Somehow she knew this letter wasn't really from me, but she also knew that every word being spoken was true. The priest paused, letting the words settle over the congregation. The silence was deafening. Sarah's family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some of Sarah's relatives who had been whispering about me earlier now looked ashamed, staring down at their hands. I remember the night you graduated from law school, the priest read on, and I was so proud I could barely contain myself. I wanted to tell everyone in that auditorium that you were my son, that every achievement of yours was built on the foundation of love your mother and I gave you, but I also knew that you'd worked just as hard as I had. Your success was your own, and I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything for the choices I made. I thought back to that graduation day. I'd sat in the very back of the auditorium then too, wanting to give Michael his moment without any distractions. I'd watched him walk across that stage and receive his diploma, and I'd never felt so proud in my entire life. But I'd also felt something else that day, a growing distance between us, as if his success was creating a wall between the life he was building and the simple working-class world he'd come from. Michael was staring directly at me now, his eyes wide with something between shock and recognition. I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly, his hands clenched at his sides. Sarah reached for his arm, but he barely seemed to notice her touch. The truth is, the priest continued, I've been afraid that admitting I needed help would make me seem weak in your eyes, afraid that acknowledging my limitations would somehow diminish all the strength I tried to show you when you were growing up. Your mother always said I was too stubborn for my own good, and she was right. A small, involuntary sob escaped from my throat. Maria had said those exact words to me countless times. She'd begged me to accept help from others, to stop trying to carry every burden alone. Even on her deathbed, she'd made me promise to lean on people when I needed to let Michael help me when the time came. But I'd broken that promise. My pride had been stronger than my wisdom. I need you to know, the priest read, his voice growing stronger, that every time you've helped me these past few years, every ride to the doctor, every phone call to explain my insurance, every moment of patience when I couldn't figure out the new technology, it wasn't just help you were giving me, it was love. And I was too proud and too scared to recognize it as the gift it was. The tears were flowing freely down my cheeks now. I didn't care who saw them. I looked around the church and realized that many of the guests were crying too. Even some of Sarah's family members, the ones who had been so dismissive of me earlier, were wiping their eyes. But it was Michael's reaction that broke my heart. My strong, successful son was crying openly at the altar, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The mask of indifference he'd worn for the past 2 years had completely fallen away, revealing the pain and guilt he'd been carrying. I see now that I turned your acts of love into burdens, the priest continued, and I flinched again at that word. When you called to check on me, I made you feel like you were interrupting your busy life. When you offered to help with my appointments, I made you feel guilty for having other obligations. I turned your kindness into a source of stress instead of recognizing it for what it truly was. A son honoring his father just as his father had tried to honor him. The priest paused again, folding the letter carefully, but he wasn't done yet. There was more to read, and somehow I knew the hardest part was coming. Michael, the priest said, his voice now addressing my son directly, I need to tell you about the night your mother died. Michael's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. We'd never talked about that night in detail. He'd been at the hospital, but I'd sent him home to get some rest during what we all thought would be a long vigil. You weren't there when she passed because I sent you away, the priest read. I told you to go home, to get some sleep, that I would call if anything changed. But the truth was, I wanted those last moments with her to be private. I wanted to say goodbye without having to be strong for anyone else. I remembered that night so clearly. Maria had been unconscious for hours, the machines beeping steadily around her bed. Michael had been there all day, holding her hand, talking to her even though the doctors said she probably couldn't hear us anymore. Before she died, the priest continued, your mother woke up for just a few minutes. She was so weak she could barely whisper, but she made me promise her 3 things. First, that I would take care of myself and not try to carry everything alone. Second, that I would let you help me when I needed it, and that I would see your help as love, not as failure on my part. The church was completely silent now, except for the sound of muffled crying. Even the ushers at the back of the church had stopped their quiet movements to listen. The third promise she asked me to make, the priest read, was the hardest one of all. She made me promise that I would never let you blame yourself for not being there when she died. She said she was grateful you weren't there to see her suffer, and that she wanted your last memory of her to be from earlier that day, when you made her laugh by telling her about the case you were working on. Michael's legs seemed to give out slightly, and his best man stepped forward to steady him. I could see the weight of 26 years of guilt lifting from his shoulders, and it was almost too much to bear. I wanted to run to him, to hold him the way I had when he was a little boy and had nightmares, but I was trapped in that back row, relegated to the role of distant observer in my own son's life. I broke all 3 of those promises, the priest continued reading. I didn't take care of myself. I let my pride make me sicker and more isolated than I needed to be. I didn't let you help me with grace. Instead, I made every kindness feel like an imposition. And worst of all, I let you carry the guilt about your mother's death when she specifically asked me to prevent that. The priest looked up from the letter, his eyes scanning the congregation before settling on Michael. She also wanted me to tell you something else, Michael. Something she said was the most important thing of all. Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself enough to listen. She said to tell you that every sacrifice your father made was made with joy. Every double shift, every missed weekend, every penny saved for your education, none of it was a burden to him. It was the privilege of his life to be your father, and he would do it all again 1,000 times over if it meant giving you the opportunities he never had. I thought about all those nights I'd come home exhausted from the steel mill, my hands black with grime, my back aching from the physical labor. But when I'd see Michael at the kitchen table doing his homework, or when he'd run to greet me at the door with stories about his day at school, every ounce of fatigue would disappear. If this part also touched your heart, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this. The priest wasn't finished with the letter yet. He unfolded it again and continued reading. Michael, I know I've become difficult to love lately. I know my neediness and my health problems have made our relationship strained, but I need you to understand that even in my worst moments, even when I was most frustrated with my limitations, I never stopped being grateful for the man you became. I watched my son's face as these words washed over him. The anger and resentment that had been building between us for years was melting away, replaced by the raw pain of recognition. I see you struggling to balance your new life with your obligations to me, the priest read, and I realize now that I made those obligations feel like burdens instead of opportunities. When you got engaged to Sarah, I should have celebrated the expansion of our family instead of worrying about where I would fit in your new life. Sarah was crying now too, her perfectly applied makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She was looking at me with what seemed like shame and regret, finally understanding the depth of what had been lost in all the wedding planning and social positioning. I want you to know, the priest continued, that I am proud of the man you've become, not just because of your professional success, but because of your character. The fact that you've continued to care for me, even when I made it difficult, shows me that your mother and I did something right in raising you. The words hung in the air like a benediction. I could feel the entire congregation holding its breath, waiting to hear how this letter would end. But I still didn't understand who had written these words or how they had come to be read at Michael's wedding. The voice was mine, the experiences were ours, but I had never put these thoughts on paper. The priest looked directly at me then, and there was something in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. He knew something I didn't know. The letter ends with a request, he announced to the congregation, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral, and somehow I knew that whatever came next was going to change everything. The priest's hands trembled slightly as he held the letter, and for a moment I thought he might not continue. The entire cathedral seemed suspended in time, every guest hanging on his words. The request, the priest said, his voice carrying with newfound strength, is simple but profound. Your father asks that you forgive him, not for the sacrifices he made, but for making you feel guilty about accepting them. He asks that you forgive him for his pride, for pushing you away when he should have pulled you closer, and for allowing fear to poison the love between you. Michael was openly sobbing now, his whole body shaking. Sarah had moved closer to him, her own tears mixing with his as she finally understood the depth of pain that had been festering in our family. But the priest wasn't finished. He looked directly at me again, and this time I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. Recognition. He knew exactly who I was and where I was sitting. And he asks, the priest continued, that if his son can find it in his heart to forgive an old man's mistakes, would he please come to the back of the church right now and bring his father to the front row where he belongs. The words hit the congregation like a physical force. Gasps echoed throughout the cathedral. Sarah's mother looked horrified, her carefully planned seating arrangement about to be demolished by an act of love. Michael stood frozen for a moment, staring at the priest as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Then his eyes found mine across that vast space, and I saw something there I hadn't seen in years, pure, desperate love. Without hesitation, without caring about protocol or propriety, or what any of Sarah's family might think, my son stepped away from the altar. His best man reached out to stop him, confused, but Michael gently shook him off. And then he was walking. Not down the center aisle where he'd entered, but along the side, making his way toward me in that back row where I'd been exiled. Every step he took seemed to echo through the cathedral like thunder. The guests turned in their seats, following his progress with wide eyes and open mouths. Sarah's relatives whispered frantically to each other, clearly scandalized by this breach of wedding etiquette. But I didn't care about any of them. All I could see was my son, walking toward me with determination and love written across his face. When he reached my row, he stopped. We stared at each other for a long moment, 26 years of hurt and misunderstanding hanging between us like a bridge we both needed to cross. "Dad," he whispered, and his voice broke on the word. I tried to stand, but my legs were shaking too badly. Michael immediately reached out to help me, his strong hands supporting my arms as I struggled to my feet. The same hands that had grown strong carrying the books I'd bought him, writing the papers that earned him scholarships, building the career that had made him successful. "I'm sorry," I whispered back, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry, son." "No," he said firmly, pulling me into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I let you sit back here. I'm sorry I made you feel like a burden. I'm sorry I forgot that everything I am is because of what you gave me." We held each other there in that back row, both of us crying openly, both of us finally admitting to the love that had never really died, but had gotten buried under years of pride and misplaced guilt. The congregation watched in stunned silence as Michael helped me gather my coat and my cane. Then, with his arm supporting mine, we began the long walk toward the front of the church. But this wasn't a walk of shame or obligation. This was a procession of reconciliation, of a son publicly honoring his father, of a family being restored in front of everyone who mattered to them. As we passed each row, I could see the faces of the guests changing. Sarah's relatives, who had been so dismissive earlier, now looked ashamed of their attitudes. Some of them were crying themselves, perhaps thinking of their own parents, their own fractured relationships that pride had damaged. Mrs. Patterson smiled through her tears as we passed, reaching out to squeeze my free hand. "That's where you belong, Robert," she whispered. "That's where you've always belonged." When we reached the front row, there was a moment of awkward silence. The pew was filled with Sarah's immediate family, her parents, her siblings, their children. Mrs. Hendricks looked up at us with poorly concealed annoyance, as if we were disrupting her carefully orchestrated social event. But Sarah's father, whom I'd barely spoken to during the engagement, stood up immediately. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, extending his hand to me, "I believe this seat belongs to you." He gestured to the spot directly next to where he'd been sitting, the prime location in the front row, the place of honor reserved for the most important family members. I looked at him in surprise. Throughout the engagement, Robert Hendricks had been polite but distant, clearly seeing me as a relic from his future son-in-law's past, rather than an integral part of his future family. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for others to hear. "I didn't understand what Michael inherited from you. I was so focused on what you might need from us that I forgot to see what you'd already given." He paused, looking at Michael with new respect. "A man doesn't become the kind of person your son is by accident. That comes from the foundation his parents built. I should have honored that from the beginning. Mrs. Hendricks looked mortified by her husband's public change of heart, but she moved over to make room anyway. Michael helped me sit down, settling beside me in what had probably been Sarah's brother's seat. The priest had been watching all of this with a satisfied smile, as if he'd orchestrated the whole thing, which I was beginning to suspect he had. "Now then," he said, addressing the congregation again, "I believe we have a wedding to finish." Sarah, who had been standing at the altar throughout this entire drama, was crying so hard her makeup was completely ruined. But she was also smiling, a real smile, not the practiced one from her engagement photos. As Michael stood up to return to the altar, I grabbed his hand. "Wait," I said. "I need to know. That letter, I never wrote those words. How did—" Michael smiled through his tears. "You didn't write it down, Dad, but you lived it. Every word of that letter came from conversations I had with you over the years, things you said when you thought I wasn't really listening, moments when your guard was down and your heart was showing." He knelt down beside my seat so we were eye level. "Mrs. Patterson helped me remember. After Sarah and I got engaged, I went to see her because I was feeling guilty about how distant we'd become. She reminded me of all the times you'd talked about Mom's last words, about your regrets, about how proud you were of me even when I was being difficult. I thought about all those evenings sitting on my apartment balcony with Mrs. Patterson, sharing a beer and talking about life. I'd never realized Michael had been listening to those conversations, that he'd been piecing together the emotions I'd been too proud to express directly. I wrote down everything I could remember," Michael continued. "Every piece of wisdom, every expression of love, every regret you'd shared. Then I asked Father Morrison if he would read it during the ceremony. I wanted everyone here to understand who you really are and what you mean to me. Father Morrison." I looked up at the priest with new understanding. He'd been our family's priest when Michael was young, before we'd drifted away from the church after Maria died. He'd officiated at her funeral, had been there during some of our darkest days. "He knew," I whispered. "He knew," Michael confirmed. "And when I told him about the seating arrangement Sarah's family had planned, he insisted we do something about it. That's where the Burden nameplate came from. He wanted to make sure everyone understood exactly what was happening before he read the letter." I felt a wave of gratitude toward this priest who had risked disrupting a wedding to restore a relationship. He had seen through the social politeness and wedding formalities to the human hearts that were breaking beneath the surface. "But why didn't you just talk to me?" I asked. "Why go through all this?" Michael's face grew serious. "Because I tried, Dad. I tried calling, I tried visiting, I tried bringing it up in conversation, but every time I got close to talking about our problems, you'd change the subject or minimize your needs or insist everything was fine. Your pride was like a wall I couldn't get through." He was right. I had been deflecting, minimizing, pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. I'd been so afraid of being seen as weak or needy that I'd made it impossible for my son to reach me. So I decided that if I couldn't get through your pride privately, maybe I could break through it publicly, in front of all these people, with Mom's memory as my witness and with God's house as our sanctuary. Michael stood up and kissed my forehead, the same way I used to kiss his when he was little and having trouble sleeping. "I love you, Dad. I always have, and I'm proud to be your son." As he walked back to the altar, I watched him with new eyes. This confident, successful man was still the little boy who used to wait by the window for me to come home from work. Still the teenager who'd cried on my shoulder when he didn't make the basketball team. Still the young man who'd called me first when he passed the bar exam. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that becoming an adult doesn't mean you stop needing your parents. It just means you need them differently. Sarah met Michael at the altar, and I could see them whispering to each other. She kept glancing over at me, and I realized she was apologizing. She was young, caught between her family's expectations and her love for Michael, and she'd made the wrong choice. But she was making the right one now. Father Morrison smiled at the young couple, then addressed the congregation once more. "Love," he said, "is not always easy to recognize. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice, sometimes it looks like service, and sometimes it looks like the courage to be vulnerable. What we've witnessed here today is the restoration of love that was always present, but had been clouded by pride and misunderstanding." He looked directly at me. "Robert, your son asked me to tell you one more thing. He wanted you to know that he doesn't see your age or your limitations as burdens. He sees them as opportunities. Opportunities to give back to the man who gave him everything. Opportunities to honor the sacrifices you made. Opportunities to show you the same unconditional love you showed him." The words washed over me like a benediction. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. But Father Morrison wasn't finished yet. He raised his hand, calling for the congregation's attention one more time. "Before we continue with the ceremony," he announced, "I want everyone here to understand something important. What Robert Sullivan gave his son wasn't just financial support or practical guidance. He gave him a blueprint for how to love unconditionally, how to sacrifice with joy, how to build character through adversity." The priest's eyes swept across the congregation, settling on various members of Sarah's family who had been so dismissive earlier. "When we judge people based on their current circumstances, rather than their lifetime of contributions, we dishonor not just them, but ourselves. Every person in this cathedral has something to learn from the kind of love Robert showed his son and the kind of gratitude Michael is showing his father today." I felt the weight of those words settling over the entire gathering. This wasn't just about Michael and me anymore. It was about how we all choose to see and value each other, especially the elderly, especially those who might need help, especially those who've given everything they had to the people they love. Father Morrison continued, "I've been a priest for 37 years and I've officiated at hundreds of weddings. But I've never seen a more beautiful demonstration of what family really means than what just happened in these pews. This is what love looks like when it's tested and proven true. If this part also touched your heart, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this." The congregation was completely silent now, absorbing the gravity of what they'd witnessed. I could see some of Sarah's relatives looking at their own elderly parents with new eyes, perhaps recognizing their own patterns of taking their elders for granted. "Now," Father Morrison said, his voice returning to its ceremonial tone, "let us continue with this celebration of love, remembering that the love between husband and wife is built on the foundation of the love that raised them, the sacrifices that shaped them, and the family bonds that sustain them." As the traditional ceremony resumed, I found myself sitting in that front row feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: complete belonging. Not tolerance, not accommodation, but genuine belonging. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, valued for who I was, honored for what I'd given, and welcomed into the future my son was building. When Father Morrison asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was profound and meaningful. This wasn't just the absence of objection, it was the presence of unified support, of a community that had just learned something important about love and family. The ring exchange took on deeper meaning too. As Michael and Sarah promised to love each other through all of life's challenges, I understood that they were also promising to face those challenges as a united family, not just the two of them, but all of us together. "You may kiss the bride," Father Morrison announced, and when Michael kissed Sarah, it felt like the sealing not just of their marriage, but of our family's healing. As the recessional music began, I knew that everything was about to change. The word burden had been transformed from a weapon meant to wound into a catalyst for the most beautiful reconciliation I could have imagined. The young couple turned to face their guests, radiant with joy and love. But before they began their walk down the aisle, Michael reached out his hand to me. "Dad," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "will you walk with us?" And as we moved together toward the doors of the cathedral, Michael and Sarah in the center, me on Michael's left side, my hand resting on my son's arm, I realized that I wasn't walking out of my old life into something uncertain. I was walking into the rest of my story, surrounded by love, valued for who I am, and ready to embrace whatever comes next with the family that had chosen to keep me close rather than push me away. The transformation was complete. The burden had become a blessing, the exile had become a homecoming, and the ending I'd feared had become a beautiful new beginning. The wedding ceremony continued, but everything had changed. As Father Morrison guided Michael and Sarah through their vows, I found myself truly seeing my future daughter-in-law for the first time. When she spoke her promises to love and honor Michael, her eyes kept drifting to me, and I could see something new there, not the polite distance I'd grown accustomed to, but genuine warmth and what looked like regret. She was young, I reminded myself, young and trying to navigate the complex social expectations of her family while building a life with my son. "Do you, Michael Robert Sullivan," Father Morrison said, "take Sarah Elizabeth Hendricks to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part." Michael's voice was strong and clear when he answered, "I do." But then he did something unexpected. He turned slightly toward me and added, "With the blessing of my father, who taught me what it means to love someone unconditionally." A murmur rippled through the congregation. This wasn't part of the traditional ceremony, but Father Morrison smiled and nodded approvingly. When it was Sarah's turn, she also deviated from the script. After saying "I do," she looked directly at me and said, "And I promise to honor and welcome Robert Sullivan not as a burden to bear, but as a blessing to our family. I promise to learn from his wisdom and to help Michael be the kind of son his father deserves." The tears started flowing again, but these were different tears, tears of joy and relief and hope for the future. Sarah's mother looked mortified by this public deviation from their carefully planned ceremony, but her father was nodding approvingly, and I could see several of their relatives wiping their eyes. After the rings were exchanged and the couple was pronounced husband and wife, Michael kissed his bride with a passion and joy that hadn't been there during the rehearsal. This wasn't just the culmination of a social event anymore, it was the beginning of a real family. As the recessional music began, Michael broke another tradition. Instead of walking straight down the aisle with Sarah, he stopped at my pew first. "Dad," he said, extending his hand to me, "would you walk us out?" I looked at him in confusion. "Son, that's not how it's done." The bride and groom walk out together. "Maybe that's how other people do it," Michael said with a grin that reminded me of the mischievous little boy he'd once been. "But our family does things differently." He helped me stand, and then, to the astonishment of everyone present, the three of us walked down the aisle together, Michael in the middle, Sarah on his right, and me on his left, my hand resting on his arm for support. It was the longest walk of my life, but also the most meaningful. With each step, I felt the weight of years of misunderstanding and hurt lifting from my shoulders. The guests stood as we passed, but their expressions were no longer polite obligation. They were witnessing something real and raw and beautiful, the restoration of a family that had almost lost its way. Mrs. Patterson was beaming as we passed her row, and she reached out to touch my free hand. "Maria would be so proud," she whispered, and I knew she was right. When we reached the back of the cathedral, the photographer was waiting to capture the traditional post-ceremony shots. But again, Michael surprised everyone. "I want the first picture to be with my dad," he announced. "Just the two of us." Sarah immediately stepped aside, encouraging the photographer to take the shot. As Michael and I stood together, his arm around my shoulders, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the simple joy of being proud of my son and knowing that he was proud of me too. "Now one with all three of us," Sarah said, joining us for the next photo. She positioned herself on my other side, and as the camera flashed, she leaned over and whispered in my ear, "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." The reception was held at the country club where Sarah's family were members, a place I'd driven past countless times but never imagined I'd be inside. The ballroom was elegant beyond anything I'd ever experienced, with crystal chandeliers and tables draped in white linen. But the biggest surprise came when we entered, and I saw the seating arrangements. The head table, where the bride and groom traditionally sat with their wedding party, had been reconfigured. Instead of the standard layout, there were two additional chairs, one for me and one for Mrs. Hendricks's elderly father, who had flown in from Florida. "We made some last-minute changes," Sarah explained as she guided me to my seat. Michael helped me understand that honoring our parents is more important than following tradition. During the cocktail hour, something remarkable happened. People began approaching me, not out of obligation but out of genuine curiosity and respect. Sarah's uncle, a successful businessman, wanted to hear about my years at the steel mill. Her college roommate asked about what it was like raising Michael alone after his mother died. But the most meaningful conversation came from Sarah's teenage nephew, a quiet boy who'd been sitting alone during the ceremony. "Mr. Sullivan?" he said hesitantly as I stood on the terrace getting some fresh air. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, son. My dad died when I was 10, he said, looking out over the club's manicured gardens. "My mom's been raising me by herself, and sometimes I see how tired she gets. Sometimes I think I'm too much for her to handle." My heart broke for this young man. "What's your name?" "Tyler." "Tyler, let me tell you something. When your mom looks at you, she doesn't see a burden. She sees every dream she ever had for you coming true. She sees the person she's working so hard to help you become. The sacrifices she makes, they're not sacrifices to her. They're investments in the most important thing in her life, you." He looked at me with eyes that seemed much older than his 16 years. "But what if I can't live up to what she's given me? What if I disappoint her?" "You want to know the secret?" I asked, thinking of Michael and all the fears I'd carried over the years. The only way you can disappoint her is if you stop trying to be the best version of yourself. It's not about being perfect or never needing help. It's about recognizing the love behind the sacrifice and honoring it by becoming someone worthy of that love. Tyler nodded slowly, and I could see him processing this idea. Did Michael ever worry about that? I smiled, thinking of all the late-night conversations my son and I had shared when he was struggling through law school. Every day. But look how he turned out, and look how proud I am of him. Mr. Sullivan, Tyler said as he prepared to return to the reception. Thank you, and I'm sorry people were calling you a burden earlier. That was wrong. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere of the reception transformed completely. What had started as a formal, somewhat stiff social gathering became a real celebration of family and love. During the father-daughter dance, I watched Sarah and her father with new understanding. He was a good man who had simply been caught up in social expectations and the desire to give his daughter what he thought she wanted. But I could see the love between them, and it reminded me of the dances I'd shared with Michael at various father-son events over the years. When the song ended, the DJ announced that it was time for the mother-son dance. But instead of calling for Michael and his mother-in-law, the music stopped. Michael walked over to me, extending his hand. Dad, I know this is traditionally for mothers and sons, but would you dance with me? It's something I should have asked for years ago. I looked at him in surprise. Son, I don't know if these old bones are up for dancing. Then we'll take it slow, he said with a grin. Besides, you taught me everything I know about being a man. The least I can do is let you teach me how to dance properly. The DJ, apparently briefed on this change, started playing The Way You Look Tonight, the same song Maria and I had danced to at our own wedding. As Michael and I moved slowly around the dance floor, I felt Maria's presence so strongly, it was almost like she was there with us. You know, Michael said as we swayed to the music, I remember you dancing with Mom in the kitchen when I was little. I used to watch from the doorway and hope that someday I'd find someone who would look at me the way she looked at you. And did you? I asked, glancing over at Sarah, who was watching us with tears in her eyes. I think so, he said, but I also learned something else from watching you two. I learned that love isn't just about the good times. It's about staying committed when things get difficult, about choosing each other every day, even when it's hard. As the song wound down, Michael pulled me closer. I'm sorry I forgot that lesson for a while, Dad. I'm sorry I made you feel like your needs were a burden, instead of an opportunity for me to show you the same love you showed me. We both forgot some important things, I admitted, but we remembered them when it mattered most. When the dance ended, something beautiful happened. Instead of applauding, the entire reception stood in respectful silence for a moment. Then Sarah's father began clapping, and soon the whole room erupted in genuine, heartfelt applause. As the evening continued, I found myself surrounded by warmth and acceptance I hadn't felt in years. Sarah's grandmother, a dignified woman in her 80s, spent 20 minutes telling me about her own struggles with aging and how much she appreciated seeing a father and son reconcile their differences. Too many families let pride destroy their relationships, she said. What happened here tonight gives me hope. But perhaps the most touching moment came during the cake cutting. As Michael and Sarah prepared to feed each other the traditional first bite, Sarah stopped. Wait, she said, addressing the room. Before we do this, I need to say something. She turned to me, holding the cake knife in her hands. Mr. Sullivan, when Michael and I got engaged, I thought I was just marrying him. I didn't understand that I was joining a family with a history, with sacrifices that made my husband the man I fell in love with. She paused, gathering her courage. I made some mistakes in planning this wedding. I let social expectations override what was right. But I want everyone here to know that from this day forward, you are not just welcome in our family, you are cherished in our family. She walked over to me with a small piece of cake. Would you do us the honor of having the first bite? After all, without you, there would be no Michael, and without Michael, there would be no us. As I accepted that piece of cake, I felt the final walls between past hurts and future possibilities crumble completely. This young woman, who I judged as shallow and social climbing, had proven herself to have a heart big enough to embrace not just my son, but me and all my imperfections. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of conversation, laughter, and dancing. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I was valued for who I was, rather than tolerated as an obligation. Mrs. Patterson found me later in the evening, sitting on the terrace and watching the city lights twinkle below us. You know, she said, settling into the chair beside me, Maria would have loved tonight. She always worried that you'd become isolated after she was gone, that your pride would keep you from accepting help when you needed it. She was right to worry, I admitted. I almost let my stubbornness cost me the most important relationship in my life. But you didn't, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. And now look what you have. Not just your son back, but a daughter who truly wants to know you. And someday, mark my words, grandchildren who will grow up adoring their grandfather. The thought of grandchildren filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. The possibility of a future filled with family gatherings, birthday parties, bedtime stories, and all the small moments that make life meaningful. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, tap the red button that says subscribe. It's free, and it helps me keep sharing. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Michael and Sarah prepared to depart for their honeymoon. But before they left, Michael pulled me aside one more time. Dad, Sarah and I have been talking, and we want you to know that when we get back from our honeymoon, things are going to be different. We want to have dinner together every Sunday. We want you to be part of our daily lives, not just an obligation we check off a list. But son, I protested, you're newlyweds. You need time to build your own life together. We want to build that life with you in it, Sarah said, joining our conversation. Michael has told me so many stories about growing up with you, about the wisdom you shared, about the values you taught him. I want to learn from that. I want our children someday to know their grandfather not as a burden, but as the foundation of our family. As I watched them drive away toward their new life together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about the future. The honeymoon limousine disappeared around the corner, taking my son and his bride toward 2 weeks in Italy, but also toward a life that would include me in meaningful ways. Mrs. Hendricks approached me as I stood watching their departure. Throughout the evening, she had been observing the transformation in her family's reception, seeing how her guests had responded to the story they'd witnessed. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice much softer than it had been earlier in the day, "I owe you an apology. I allowed social concerns to override basic human decency, and I'm ashamed of that." I turned to look at her, this elegant woman who had been so concerned with appearances and proper protocols. "I've been thinking about what happened in the church today," she continued, "and I realized that my behavior wasn't just unkind to you, it was a disservice to my daughter. She married into a family with real values, real love, real substance, and I almost made her complicit in dishonoring that. Sarah's a good woman," I said. "She just needed time to understand the situation. She gets her strength from Michael, and Michael gets his strength from you. I can see that now. And I want you to know that going forward, you'll never question your place in this family again, not if I have anything to say about it." As the country club emptied and the evening came to an end, I found myself in Mrs. Patterson's car, riding back toward my apartment. But instead of feeling like I was returning to isolation and loneliness, I felt like I was returning to rest before beginning a new chapter of my life. "You know what the most beautiful part of tonight was, Mrs.?" Patterson asked as we drove through the quiet Chicago streets. "What's that?" "Watching that young man become the son his father deserved, and watching that father realize he'd raised exactly the kind of man he'd hoped to raise. I thought about that as we drove, about the journey Michael and I had taken from that moment of devastating hurt at the church to the dance floor where we'd held each other and remembered what we meant to each other. The word burden had started the day as a weapon designed to wound and exclude, but by the end of the evening, it had become the catalyst for the most healing conversation our family had ever had. As Mrs. Patterson walked me to my apartment door, I realized that tomorrow would be the first day in years that I'd wake up knowing I was truly loved and valued by my family. Not tolerated, not accommodated, but cherished. "Get some rest, Robert," she said, giving me a hug goodbye. "You've got a busy future ahead of you. Lots of Sunday dinners to attend, lots of grandchildren to spoil someday." I stood in my doorway watching her drive away, then looked up at the stars barely visible above the city lights. Somewhere in Italy, Michael and Sarah were beginning their honeymoon, but they were also beginning a marriage that would include me as a valued family member rather than an unwelcome obligation. The transformation was complete. The burden had become a blessing. The exile had become a homecoming, and the ending I'd feared had become a beautiful new beginning. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about Maria and how proud she would have been of the man our son had become, of the family he was building, of the love that had survived pride and misunderstanding to emerge stronger than ever. For the first time in years, I fell asleep excited about tomorrow, about next week, about the future that stretched ahead of me filled with family, purpose, and love. The nameplate had said burden, but the evening had taught us all what it really means to bear and share love across generations, and I wouldn't have it any other way. 3 months after the wedding, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The Sunday dinners that Michael and Sarah had promised became the cornerstone of my week, but they were just the beginning of how our relationship had evolved. It started small. Michael began calling me every Wednesday evening, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to hear about my week. Sarah would often get on the phone too, asking for my advice about everything from her garden to her struggles with learning to cook Michael's favorite meals. "I want to make your mother's meatloaf recipe," she said during one of these calls. "Michael says it was his favorite, but the recipe you gave me doesn't include cooking times." I chuckled, remembering how Maria had never written down exact measurements for anything. "That's because Maria cooked by feel, not by the book. Come over Saturday morning and I'll teach you properly." These cooking lessons became a weekly tradition. Sarah would arrive at my apartment with grocery bags and a notepad, determined to master the dishes that had shaped Michael's childhood. But somewhere between learning to knead bread dough and understanding when the onions were properly caramelized, we began to build something neither of us had expected, a real relationship. By December, something extraordinary happened. Sarah made an announcement that would reshape our family forever. It was during our usual Sunday dinner, and I noticed Sarah had barely touched her food. She kept glancing at Michael with a nervous smile, and he seemed equally anxious. "Dad," Michael said as we finished the main course, "Sarah and I have some news to share." "We're pregnant," Sarah said, her face breaking into a radiant smile. "You're going to be a grandfather." The fork slipped from my hand and clattered onto my plate. For a moment I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I'd just heard. "A grandfather," I whispered, and suddenly I was crying again. But these were tears of pure joy. "There's something else," Michael said, settling back into his chair but keeping one hand on my shoulder. "We want to ask you to move in with us." I stared at them both, certain I'd misunderstood. "Move in with you? We've been looking at houses," Sarah explained, "and we found one with a perfect in-law suite. You'd have complete privacy when you want it, but you'd also be right there to help with the baby." "Dad," Michael said, his voice growing serious, "I learned everything I know about being a father from you. Now I want to give those same gifts to my child, but I want to do it with your help. We want our baby to know their grandfather," Sarah added. "Really know you, not just see you on holidays. We want them to hear your stories, learn your values, understand where their father came from." The house they'd found was perfect. A beautiful colonial with an in-law suite attached to the main house, but with its own entrance through a small garden. It was large enough for my furniture and my books, but close enough that I could hear the sound of family life just beyond the connecting door. Moving day was an adventure. Mrs. Patterson helped coordinate everything, and to my surprise, several of Sarah's family members showed up to help. Her father worked alongside Michael carrying boxes, and her mother spent the afternoon helping me arrange furniture. If you've ever experienced the healing power of family reconciliation, share from what corner of the world you're watching this story unfold. By February, our routine was well established. I'd wake up in my own space, but by mid-morning I'd usually find myself in the main house, sharing coffee with Sarah while Michael got ready for work. These morning conversations became precious to both of us. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, I found myself taking on more responsibilities around the house. Not because they asked me to, but because I wanted to. I cooked dinner most nights, started a vegetable garden, and began working on projects for the baby's nursery. "You know what the best part about this arrangement is?" Michael said one evening as we worked together in the kitchen. "What's that?" "I get to see you happy again, really happy, for the first time since Mom died." He was right. Living alone, I'd been existing rather than truly living, but here, surrounded by family and purpose, I felt alive again. As spring turned toward summer and Sarah's due date approached, I realized that the word burden had completely disappeared from our vocabulary. In its place were words like partnership, family, love, and belonging. The baby was due any day now, and I was ready to begin the next chapter of my life, not as someone being cared for, but as someone with care to give. On July 15th, at 3:47 in the morning, my granddaughter entered the world. I was in the hospital waiting room when Michael burst through the doors, still wearing his scrubs from being in the delivery room. His face was streaked with tears, but his smile was so bright it could have powered the entire building. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "She's here. She's perfect. Sarah wants to see you." When I entered Sarah's room, she was holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. The sight took my breath away. "Mr. Sullivan," Sarah said softly. "Come meet your granddaughter." I approached slowly, and Sarah carefully placed the baby in my arms. She was so small, so perfect, with tiny fingers that immediately wrapped around my thumb. When she opened her eyes and looked directly at me, I saw something that made my heart stop. "She has Maria's eyes," I whispered. "We noticed that too," Michael said. "It's like Mom is here with us." "What's her name?" I asked. "Maria Grace Sullivan," Sarah replied. "We wanted to honor your wife and Grace because that's what she represents for our family. A new beginning." I started crying then, tears falling onto the baby blanket as I held my granddaughter close. All those years of feeling like a burden, and here they were naming their daughter after my beloved Maria. Over the following weeks, I discovered I was a natural grandfather. When she cried at night, I was often the one who could soothe her. When Sarah struggled with new motherhood, I was there with experience and patience. "I don't know what we would do without you," Sarah said one evening. "You'd figure it out," I assured her, "but I'm grateful I get to be here to help." As I sat in my garden one evening, holding Maria while she slept, I whispered the words I'd wanted to say for so long. "Your grandmother would be so proud of what we've built here." The nameplate at the wedding had said, "Burden," but it had led to this moment. Surrounded by love, valued for who I am, needed and wanted by the people who matter most. In this quiet, perfect moment, with my family sleeping peacefully around me and my granddaughter safe in my arms, I knew that Maria's final wish for me had finally come true. I was no longer carrying my burdens alone. I was sharing them with people who loved me. And that, I realized, is what family really means.